Okay, the last two lectures that I gave you last week were exploring the effects and the legacies of the First World War. And in particular, I was talking to you about the attempt to grapple with an impending sense of crisis, whether that crisis was an economic crisis or whether it was a political and cultural crisis, and the various attempts made to stabilize Britain and its empire in the period of the 20s and 1930s. This lecture is the last about this period between the two world wars, because on Thursday we'll talk about the Second World War. And this one looks at a different type of political and cultural crisis that becomes increasingly evident in the 1920s and 1930s. And it's one generated by, in many ways, by the new democratic settlement of 1918 and 1928, when Britain, of course, finally becomes a democracy in which everybody has the chance to vote. And this leads to a new set of concerns about the nature of cultural life, and in particular about the nature of popular culture, or what increasingly is termed mass culture, and the effect it is having on Britain's new democratic society, how it was that the new citizens were going to be educated and informed about their new duties as citizens. The very important backdrop to all of this was not just people getting the vote for the first time, but the rise of fascism across Europe, and the fear of many people across the political spectrum that the new forms of commercialized mass culture were corroding the very fabric of civil society, and were creating conditions in Britain that would make the spread of fascism possible even there. Now, in some ways, this already begins to sound not unfamiliar to the lecture that I gave you about popular culture in the Victorian period, when you'll remember there was the rise of a new ethos of rational recreation, and the birth of the idea of leisure being about the chance to recreate the individual, to create fit and proper persons who would one day be potential voters. And there are important continuities that I'm going to return to throughout the lecture. But I want to emphasize, first of all, that in many ways the arrival of mass democracy and the spectre of Bolshevism and fascism across the continent of Europe reworked that old liberal problem about how you make recreation rational, how it is that you provide improving forms of leisure. And that happened in two ways, I think. The first was that leisure became understood in a different way as a type of right, that people began to campaign for the acquisition of paid holidays. Remember that in the 19th century nobody received a paid holiday. Okay? That holidays basically followed annual customary holidays in which people just had a week off work without pay. The trade union movement begins the campaign for paid holidays in 1911. But that campaign really escalates after the war, when the right to paid holidays is seen as a new type of social right that Britain's citizens should be able to demand, especially because it was increasingly common that salaried workers, that growing sector of the middle classes that receive salaries, not wages, had begun to have quite well-established 1 to 2 week holidays, mainly on the grounds that brain work, so-called brain work, was far more exhausting than manual labour. So by 1920, just about 1.5 million people in Britain had these paid holidays. In the 1930s, the campaign for the extension of paid holidays accelerates, and it accelerates partly because many other countries are beginning to introduce paid holidays. There are 24 other countries with paid holidays by the late 1930s. So the Trade Union Congress, the TUC, and the left-leaning newspaper, the Daily Herald, which the trade union movement takes over ownership of in the beginning of the 1930s, led this big push for paid holidays, and eventually it pays off in 1938 with the Paid Holidays Act, which extends paid holidays to 11 million workers receiving a 1 week holiday. So that's the first context, that leisure begins to be claimed as a new type of social right. The other was that leisure was invested with a new imperative, that the conduct of leisure had to be socially responsible, that citizens had to show that they were socially responsible by using their leisure time to be informed and actively engaged as citizens. And the key context there was, of course, the idea that mass culture was eroding the fabric of civil society. So leisure and recreation was now meant to be about regenerating and expressing individuality, much as it had been in the Victorian period. But the difference was that mass culture was seen to provide to an undifferentiated mass. Okay, so leisure was now meant to try and help individuals separate themselves out from the idea of a common mass culture. Because that mass culture was seen to propagate all sorts of things that were bad: escapism, passivity, and even political apathy. And it was in these conditions that many people thought that Bolshevism and fascism could take hold in Britain. So in this sense, I'm trying to suggest to you, as you'll see, that the critics of mass culture suggest that it creates a new type of democratic deficit in Britain in the 1920s and 30s, at the precise time when democracy was finally established. So let me go on to explain now how culture becomes massified. There were, of course, in the 1920s and 1930s, the emergence of new types of mass culture that hadn't really been around beforehand. So radio is a great example of that, popular music, the merchandising of popular music, the proliferation of dance halls and dance crazes, and the increasing popularity of cinema, which, of course, had been around since the beginning of the 20th century, but became a mass phenomena in the 20s and the 1930s. There was also the increasing popularity and mass forms of provision for older forms of leisure pursuits. And in a way, the best example here would be sport. And as you know, I love soccer, so the best example always is to return to soccer. By 1938, 14 million people were attending the First Division games. That's the elite league that is now in Britain called the Premier League. It used to be called the First Division. 14 million people, the vast majority of those were male. That's something close to like 50% of adult males in the country attending a soccer match every weekend. 10 million people are doing the football pools, which is like a lottery gambling system where you fill in the results and try and predict the results, and you win money if you pick the right ones. Now, one of the things that's very evident in the 1920s and the 1930s, despite the widespread poverty that we were talking about last week, was the increasing amount of money that British people spent on their leisure pursuits, which you can see grew from 1920 to 1930 from £195 million to £262 million a year. So in other words, there was new money being spent on these commercialised pursuits that make them reach out to new types of consumers. So I'm going to try and illustrate this process by looking at three examples: the newspaper press, the cinema, and my favourite of all, which is the seaside resort of Blackpool in Lancashire. Three examples, and I'm going to be emphasising three main themes through these three examples. The first is that mass culture came with the concentration of ownership, that fewer people owned more and more forms of these mass cultural forms. The second was that commercial success was often equated to what we would now describe as a dumbing down of that cultural form. That, in other words, to be commercially successful, people had to, these forms had to appeal to the lowest common denominator. And thirdly, the emphasis on escapism, an escapism that seemed to deflect people from the pressing social realities of life in Britain in the 1920s. That mass culture was seen to deflect people from becoming informed public citizens. So let's talk about the press briefly. You can see that it's in the first half of the 20th century that Britain really gets a mass newspaper reading public for the first time. And some of that is about the rising levels of literacy by the First World War, and some of that is about the declining price of newspapers with new technologies of production and distribution. As you can see, by 1945, 15 million Britons were buying daily newspapers, and a remarkable 29 million buying Sunday papers. By 1939, 69% of the population over 16 were reading a daily newspaper and 82% a Sunday paper. This is the highest levels of newspaper readership of anywhere in the world, according to a UNESCO report that came out in the late 1940s. Now, one of the concerns about this was that you had the creation at this time of newspaper barons, of figures who became immensely powerful because they owned the leading newspapers of the day, and therefore were seen to exert an undue amount of political influence. And in Britain, the two most famous newspaper barons was Lord Beaverbrook and Lord Rothermere. Both were knighted, that Lord Beaverbrook owned the Daily and Sunday Express and the Evening Standard, and Lord Rothermere captured both ends of the newspaper market by owning the Establishment Times and the popular Daily Mail. Now, both of them were also formed the United Empire Party in 1929, a poster of which you can see behind me. Lord Rothermere was indeed one of the early supporters of the British Union of Fascists in the early 1930s and even met Hitler. So clearly one of the concerns here was that these people had a uncomfortably close fascination and support for extreme right-wing politics. It also meant that having an independent voice in the newspapers became increasingly difficult. And the best examples there are the two left liberal-leaning newspapers of the Daily Herald, which went through multiple forms of ownership until it was bought by the trade union movement in 1929. It was bought by the TUC, the Trade Unions Congress, in order to make sure that there was a newspaper that was sympathetic to the interests of labour. And the trade union movement thought that if it didn't buy it, that voice would be lost. And the other great example is the Manchester Guardian, still running today as the Guardian, which became owned by the Scott Trust in order to try and maintain its independence. Now, there is at this time a huge difference that opens up between the so-called quality broadsheet newspapers, like the Times and the Telegraph and the Manchester Guardian, and the new tabloid newspapers, popular press, that was exemplified by newspapers like the Daily Express, which was the biggest selling newspaper with 2.5 million readers, the Daily Mirror, and the Daily Mail that came in a million short of the Express figures. These circulation figures dwarf those of the qualities. As you can see, the Times had a mere 213,000 readers, and the Telegraph at 640. Now, one of the things about the tabloid newspapers that some contemporaries were very critical of was that it seemed to repackage news. It seemed to tell news stories in a new type of way that seemed to dilute their potential for informing the public. So news stories were covered increasingly through human interest stories, and the newspapers were literally repackaged, and this is why I show you these two examples from the Daily Mail and the Daily Express, to have far fewer columns and to use photographs much more, to try and make news more accessible and more to be able to be read at speed. The other great innovation of the tabloid newspaper was the development of discrete sections that now all of our newspapers are organised around, so that you would have a women's section, a travel section, a business section, and of course a sports section. The Daily Mail had really began these developments before the First World War. In fact, the Daily Mail had been formed in 1896, and it was styled as the busy man's paper. The idea was that the suburban commuter could read the Daily Mail on their train journey into the city, and because it was so, the news was so easily packaged into these discrete sections and small or large columns, I should say. The other thing about the sections is, of course, and it's an obvious point, is that advertising and the use of advertising revenue becomes increasingly important to newspapers as the prices decline, and therefore advertisers could target their adverts around the particular demographics that they thought would be reading a sports section, a business section, or a women's section. And of course, contemporaries were concerned about that growing, increasingly intimate relationship between news and advertising. So let me talk about my second example, which is cinema. And again, the same thing is really evident in here. Cinema had, of course, existed before the First World War, but it, as I said, becomes a mass phenomenon really in the 1920s and the 1930s, perhaps especially after the introduction of talkies in 1928. And just as with newspapers, you get the same process of the concentration of ownership through the creation of large national cinema chains. And the three big ones in Britain were Gaumont, that owned 300 cinemas by 1928, ABC, Associated British Cinemas, that owned 460 by 1937, and the Odeon chain that had 255 cinemas by 1940. Taken together, these chains owned 20% of all cinemas. And one of the things that was very noticeable about them was that they were built in increasingly impressive style, as you can see in this image of the Astoria at Brixton. You had these huge empires and palaces that were built with marble stairs, pillars, chandeliers, uniformed staff. They would be themed in particular ways, like around an Egyptian temple or a Spanish hacienda, and they could seat a remarkable number of people. So the Brixton Astoria held 4,000, held an audience of 4,000 people. An amazing number of people went to the cinema every week. There were 23 million weekly admissions, 40% of the population going every week by 1939. And the greatest concern of all of contemporaries was that the vast majority of those cinema moviegoers were the urban working class, and particularly children and the unemployed. Something like 70% of the urban working class were attending the cinema weekly. And the idea was that the contemporaries thought that they were sucked in by the plush, luxurious environment of the cinemas. So, as George Orwell wrote in The Road to Wigan Pier, you may have 3 halfpence in your pocket and not a prospect in the world, but that doesn't stop you indulging in a private daydream of yourself as Clark Gable or Greta Garbo, which compensates you for a great deal. There you have a classic formulation that the left have about cinemas being a constant form of escapism in British culture. Indeed, cinema culture is one of the first things that is associated with a critique of the influence of American culture in Britain, and the way in which that Americanized commercial mass culture breeds a type of escapism and passivity. The American movies, the westerns and the gangster movies were hugely popular in Britain. So the social research organisation Mass Observation did a survey in Bolton in 1938 that showed that 63% of Boltonians preferred Hollywood movies and just 18% British movies. So one of the problems had been was that the British film industry had basically collapsed after the First World War. By 1926, there were just 5% of the movies being shown in cinemas were British made. So the British government introduced a quota system in 1927 to try and increase the number of British films in production. This led to a massive boom in production companies and producing what were known at the time as quota quickies. It's an awkward phrase that we might associate with something else, but it led to an enormous number of new films being produced, much of which were very bad quality, but some of which proved a critical training ground for film directors who would go on to be hugely influential. Alfred Hitchcock, for instance, cut his teeth on directing quota quickies. But one of the problems with these British films was that they were stuck between heritage movies and literary adaptations, so that they were in a light rather like Downton Abbey or yet another Jane Austen screenplay adaptation. And all of the actors spoke with cut glass Oxbridge accents. They all spoke like the royal family. One of the things that this catalysed was an attempt by writers to try and write films that would speak to the realities of the social conditions and of everyday life in Britain. And a great example of this is J.B. Priestley, who you'll remember was very, very critical of Americanised mass culture, that he called this third suburban England, the one full of arterial roads and Woolworths and everything given away for football coupons, cigarette coupons, and complained that this England was full of factory girls looking like actresses. Now, what Priestley wanted to do was make actresses look like factory girls. He wanted to try and relocate British films so that working class people could actually see themselves in movies. And to that end, he wrote the screenplay for Sing As We Go, which had Britain's Greta Garbo, Gracie Fields, a hugely popular old music hall star who was reborn in the talkies movies. And I'm going to show you a clip of that film in a second. It was filmed on location in Blackpool, and it was the story about the closure of a textile mill and this woman and Greta Garbo, Gracie Fields being laid off, and then about how the mill is reopened and Gracie gets her job back. Now, the point was that these screenplay writers like Priestley, and Graham Greene ends up writing for movies as well later on, is that they try and tell a story of community over individuality. American films, they felt, focused upon the story of individuals, of the American dream. In contrast, they wanted to develop a British genre which was about community, not individuality. And you'll see this, I hope, in this fabulous clip of I keep calling her Greta Garbo, of Gracie.
Oh, crumbs.
Is your name Grace Platt?
Yes, what's yours? When did you?
Well, I have a message for you and a letter. And that young man you just saw.
Get out.
His idea of a little joke.
Very funny.
He asked me to tell you that the Greyback Mill is reopening. Here's the letter.
Welfare officer. You want me to go back to Milton, welfare officer?
They must be potty.
What are you, Parker? Do you think I can't do it, John? You're standing on me. Come off.
You're not leaving us, are you?
Yes, I am. I beg your pardon, aren't you?
Well, I wouldn't say I was, and I wouldn't say I wasn't, like, if you follow me.
I do, but don't you follow me.
Oh, I wouldn't.
No, it has to be a bad thing.
This is Blackpool.